Madam Speaker, in a debate like this, and I assume in the policy debate to ensue, on both sides of the House we will hear some very strange things. Claims and counterclaims, historical facts and distortion of historical facts, economic data and incorrect economic data. But sometimes there are things that are said that just stand out. Stand out because they are so inaccurate and seem to fly in the face of the very evidence that is before you. And of course, I think it becomes unfortunate in a budget debate like this that if time has to be spent on responding to every such statement that runs afoul of the truth of the facts before it. So I'll content myself with just two statements. I heard the member of Castries Central commenting on the expenditure patterns of the former government and this government, suggesting perhaps that this current government was not engaged in any excessive expenditure, a more than accustomed expenditure. Yet the estimates that I have before me say that this current budget before the House is something over 50 million more than the budget last year. And it is in the very document that we are supposed to debate. Then she says that they had unemployment at 24%. No one denies unemployment in St. Lucia was high, it's still very high. But then that too flies in the face of the very evidence that is available. The Economic and Social Review says, Madam Speaker, at page 39, the rate of unemployment fell to 21.3% in 2016 from 24.1% in 2015 and represents a continuation of the declining trend that started in 2015. Preliminary statistics indicate that increased activity, mainly in the construction and accommodation and food services sectors, positively impacted the labor market, resulting in a fall in the rate of unemployment. And the information that is publicly available suggests that the unemployment rate is now in the vicinity of 20% and declining. It will be a matter of debate as to who should claim credit for that, but today I will leave that alone. As to the other matters, there's a time and place for that, and I'm certain that our voices will be heard. More pointedly, Madam Speaker, in analyzing the estimates of revenue and expenditure, I ask myself, what is the message that the government wishes to convey to the people of St. Lucia, to our investors, and ultimately our financiers? This is really a very crucial question, not only because the estimates of revenue and expenditure should reflect a plan, a policy, well, not a policy, but a plan, an intention. It should offer some indication of the expected economic behavior of the government and the actors in the government. It should offer direction to financiers, particularly those who, of course, buy our bonds and other short-term financial instruments, for example, our treasury bills. Financiers need to be reassured that their investments are safe. And this is the critical question. At the end of the day, when this budget is properly perused and analyzed, will those investors feel confident enough to put in the money that this country needs to develop? Where do we get the answer to the question that I pose? In fact, where do I get the answers? Obviously, and it goes without saying, Madam Speaker, that the first source of the answer to that question has to be gleaned from the figures in the estimates of revenue and expenditure. We must pause through it to see what the signals are. I guess reference must be had to the presentation of the Minister for Finance in his explanation of the estimates of revenue and expenditure and the allocations to the various heads, whether recurrent or capital. But a third source that is also critical is the public pronouncements of the Minister of Finance on budgetary issues and challenges, whether in the media or otherwise. That's a point of reference, a critical point of reference. And finally, there's a fourth and vital source, and that's the documented assessments of the performance of the economy. For example, the reports of the International Monetary Fund, the Caribbean Development Bank, and for what it is worth, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. And we know, for example, that the IMF in its last pronouncements on the St. Lucian economy said to the government of St. Lucia that you have to make policy adjustments because of the policy decisions that you have taken in the last few months. So we are under a very watchful gaze. They all want, whether they are regional institutions or the International Monetary Fund, to see how we tackle the problems ahead and how we tackle the new problems that have emerged from the actions of the government. But I must say that the Minister for Finance, the member from Mico South, has been very helpful. I concede that. As usual, he's been very talkative and loquacious. The minister has repeatedly decried the high debt of St. Lucia. He declared to the people of St. Lucia and the world that St. Lucia was broke. That was quoted all over the place. Only recently on St. Lucia News Online, SNO, and I know that this is one of the favorite electronic channels for the minister, SNO carried a story about the removal of the subvention of the St. Lucia National Trust, and the Minister for Finance, in seeking to justify his actions, declared that we have a cash problem in the government. We are not generating enough revenues to cover all the costs that we have. We have to prioritize where we are going to spend our money, unquote. And in that same interview, he added, we have to prioritize now how we spend public funds, given the fact that there isn't enough money available. So we have a debt problem. And these are not his words, my words. So we have a debt problem, we have a money problem, we have a revenue problem, we have an expenditure problem. This is what the Minister for Finance has said to us. But what do we see? What do we see in this budget? We are broke. We have no money. Yet, we see expenditure on wages and salaries will increase by $13.8 million from $476.3 million to $490.1 million. And all of this is contained, Madam Speaker, helpfully in the summary to this budget. And the Minister of Finance clarifies it in his presentation. He says this is a 2.9% increase, which I have not checked. Why? We have a revenue problem, yet expenditure on transfers, the financing of statutory bodies, agencies and government-owned companies will increase by $18.3 million from $123.5 million to $141.8 million. Then, of course, two. One, we perhaps did not spend time on identifying. There is an increase to the Office of the Budget, and that increase, I think, is identified on page 226, if I'm correct. And that is worthy of some kind of explanation. From the revised estimates of 2006-17 of 3.1 million to 6.1 million, almost 100%. But this budget is crafted for survival on a massive deficit. The estimates project an overall deficit of $220,918,204. On the one hand, you can say, well, give the Minister of Finance a break, because in the last 10, 15 years in St. Lucia, we have had to resort to deficit financing. And when you look at the figures, it means that the fiscal deficit, which the minister claims was reduced to 1.2% GDP in the financial year 2016-17, will now be allowed by his deliberate decision to increase to 4.7% of GDP this financial year. I say claims, and I'm subject to correction, because in looking at the social and economic review, the authors of the review did not cite the figure for the overall deficit. I took a look at page 7, which in itself is surprising. It's a surprising omission. I don't know why, and I'm not intending to suggest the imputation of anything else but an omission. But I prefer to take my point of departure from the fact that the Minister of Finance says that the deficit this year, the deficit that he has inherited, that resulted at the end of the financial year, was 1.2% of GDP. I pause, Madam Speaker, because I recall I was called all kinds of names. The people of St. Lucia was told I was a little boy managing an economy. It was too much for me. Yet this Minister of Finance is perhaps the luckiest Minister of Finance in the entire Caribbean, because he has inherited a deficit that is one of the lowest, if not the lowest, in the Caribbean at this time. Why? That's the reality. Admittedly, and I wish, or I will try to be fair where I can, the minister has indicated that this was achieved because there was underspending or reduced spending on the capital side. Concede that. But even if there was the spending that had been programmed, that deficit would not have been, under any circumstances, less than 2.5. So you might have expected a deficit of 2.5% of GDP. The question is, What is the best use of that inheritance that you have got? That is the question. What is clear for all of us in this House is this. We can resolve the deficit, but unless we resolve the issue of rising debt, we remain in problems. Because deficits fuel debt. And so, if we don't tackle debts, as we are failing to do in this budget, then inevitably we are preparing for the eventuality of economic and fiscal collapse. That is what is concerning the leader of the opposition. That is what is worrying the leader of the opposition. In effect, what we have seen in this budget is a shift in policy because the former government was concerned, and the evidence is clear, with reducing the amount of debt for each budgetary cycle, but this government has decided it's going into the other direction, and it is going to fuel economic activity by heavy borrowing. So the vicious cycle continues. Madam Speaker, I am the last person in the world to blame this new administration over debt. Successive governments have had to resort to debt. St. Lucia faced one of the most cruel economic contractions ever in its recent history in the last few years and had no choice but to attempt to use its available resources and to turn to borrowing. What this is saying is that at least that there is one issue that both sides of this chamber understand is vicious, it is dangerous, and it has to be tackled. And this can never be a matter solely for one government to decide. Because whether we like it or not, we are chaining the future generation of this country. And when I say it is our responsibility, it cannot be a situation where we shout at each other across the House trying to decide who is responsible for what. That's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about a fundamental approach that looks squarely at the issue of debt, and both sides sit down and agree on a program to contain and to reduce debt. That's what I'm talking about. And you hear them. Only now. This is the same group of people in opposition who spoke about enacting a fiscal responsibility bill. That's the same set of people. It is interesting, Madam Speaker, for us to understand the relationship between deficits and debt and financial disaster. This is an interesting week in Trinidad and Tobago. The rating agency Moody's have now downgraded Trinidad and Tobago to junk status. A very serious development. And they have cited several reasons as to why Trinidad and Tobago has to be downgraded to junk status. But two stand out. Two stand out. The first is that Moody's is concerned by the fact that the fiscal deficit in Trinidad and Tobago will rise to 6% of GDP. And they make the point that the legislative changes which Trinidad made in respect of that has not yielded the revenue that the country requires to deal with its fiscal problems. Secondly, they make the point that Trinidad is on a path of rising debt. We are now approaching, I believe, 80% debt to GDP ratio. I have not worked out the figures of what the implications would be for this new cycle of debt. I have not. But I know we are approaching 80%. At least the IMF confirms that. And in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, debt currently stands at 54%, and I believe is rising, it is my understanding, to 70% estimated by the end of 2019. We are just buying time for the inevitable fiscal collapse if we do not deal with this issue of debt once and for all. Whether we like it or not, whether we accept it or not, whether we regard it as heresy, whether we want to say, well, you're only saying that now because you're in opposition, because it was a constant issue across this chamber, we are only buying time. Whether we want to accept it, as I said, we are in the danger zone because we are now at the stage of borrowing money to pay off money that we have borrowed before. It's a vicious borrowing cycle. We are borrowing money to pay debt previously incurred. And anybody knows if you run a household, the reality is that your options will run out. And this is the vital question. And I have, in the past, when I've been impressed by a contribution from the other side, I've been generous. I admit it. It was obvious that the member from Swaziland was in a different zone, in a different plane. Of course, it is true to say that he perhaps did not fully understand this is not a policy debate, but an estimates debate. But perhaps he was the one who came closest to issuing a message about this budget when he says that this budget is about inspiring confidence so the investors could buy our bonds and financial instruments. He might be right. These days the market conditions have changed somewhat. People are moving away from short-term instruments for the time being. For how long, nobody knows. But the real question for him is this: how do you inspire confidence by increasing your debt already beyond prudential limits to finance your deficit? Bearing in mind the examples that I have just cited. And I'm not going to go to Barbados. But in the minister's own words, in his own admission, we have a revenue problem. What is new about this? For the last 10 years, we have had a revenue problem in St. Lucia. We have refused to come to terms with the implication of the revenue problem. We have always known that we are not generating enough revenue to meet the expenses of the government, to pay for salaries and wages, to pay for services, your hospitals, to pay for your youth centers, to pay for your roads. We have always known that we have had a revenue problem. But if you have a revenue problem, as he freely says and admits, then you have options. One logical response is to seek to increase your revenue, but that until this budget has been disowned, that they have said that this is not a path they will pursue because the former government was about taxation, but we wait. The evidence is slowly unfolding. The second, of course, is that you can reduce expenditure. cut back expenditure significantly. But we don't see that happening in this budget. In fact, expenditure is increasing significantly. Or if you prefer, you can fashion a mix, a combined approach. You put your pedal on both expenditure and revenue, and you seek to balance them in such a way as to not allow either to overwhelm the other. Then, of course, you believe that growth will save you. Growth will save you. If you grow the economy, it will save you. Of course, new investments have a way when they're under construction. They can help your balances. But you know, you give out so many concessions when these developments are taking place that it takes several years before the real returns on the investment could occur. Because ultimately, if additional funds don't come into the government treasury from these investments, then really you're spinning top in mud at the end of the day. But what we have in these estimates at our disposal. Now, the figures are curious, Madam Speaker. The estimates show that revenue will almost remain flat. That is to say, will increase at the end of fiscal 2018 by a mere modest amount of $225,853. Now, anybody looking at those figures would be puzzled. After all, the government took a decision to reduce VAT by 2.5%, and they have lost $53 million. So that 53 million, if it's accurate, has to be made up. So if you're going to present revenue estimates that suggest it is the same thing as the previous year, because that's not going to come from additional economic activity generated in the course of this fiscal year. That's impossible. Then what's supplementing it? What's making up for it? How could revenue remain relatively flat if it is admitted that you have this reduction in your VAT intake? That's the question. Really, this is pure economic subterfuge. And the only excuse that you can find for it at this stage, which shields the government, is to say, well, we can't admit it, we can't disclose now, because we have to wait for the policy pronouncements. But the answer is clear. It means that new revenue generating measures will have to be imposed to make up for the lost revenue. And remember, the IMF said, we're watching you. To ensure that recurrent revenue performance achieves even the forecasted amount of $1.1 billion. And if that is not the case, then we wait the consequences when we report in the next estimates of revenue and expenditure in 2017, in 2018 for 2017. And the leader of the opposition has asked a valid question. I'd like to note, Madam Speaker, that excise taxes on imports is forecasted to increase from $86.8 million in 2016-17 to $104.13 million at the end of 2017-18. This is an increase of $17.5 million. What explains this significant increase in revenue intake from this head? Surely, if it is not what it appears to be, then by all means disclose it. Incidentally, Madam Speaker, what has happened to the proposed property tax amnesty in Five to Stay Alive? I mean, I remember there was an announcement last year that the homeowners in St. Lucia would be the beneficiaries of a property tax amnesty this financial year. Maybe the intention is to bring it a little closer in this current 5-year cycle. Yes, I'm coming to you. You just be patient. Be very patient. Right, now, of course, this is, no, you leave him alone. Leave him for me, leave him alone. The fact is, this amnesty cannot be for the ordinary people of St. Lucia, the poor people of St. Lucia. Because as you know, those with properties valued up to $200,000 do not pay property tax. And I know that the estimates indicate that some $12 million was collected in property tax in 2016-17, and in 2018 a sum of $11.5 million is forecasted to be collected. So the question then is, where are we with property tax? The member for Dennery South attempts to answer the question posed by the leader of the opposition. What is new in this estimates of revenue and expenditure? What really is different? And he gave us an explanation to suggest that, well, the opposition was taken by surprise because basically it is the same thing that they saw the last time. But again, there was all the hype, all the talk about a new budget approach, a new budget methodology. The point is, the Minister of Finance has had 10 months to craft this estimate of revenue and expenditure. But there are some, what I describe as delightful oddities, and some I admit occurred in my time, existed even before me, but that doesn't mean that we don't take the opportunity to rectify oddities, etc. I am, Madam Speaker, referring to the indicators of performance. And I readily admit that some of these statements that appear as performance indicators have appeared in the past and should have attracted comment. But there are some statements of pure flagellation. At page 389 of the estimates, one indicator of performance is described as number of press conferences, documentaries, news items. What does that have to do with the budget? What on earth this has to do with the performance of the budget? Likewise, the Department of Sustainable Development, Energy, Science and Technology cites the number of press releases aired as an indicator of its performance. The Office of the Prime Minister is even more amusing. An achievement is cited as, quote, percentage of ceremonies managed within budget and on schedule, unquote. So you then ask the question, the very valid question, what really was the contribution of Ernest? And by the way, Prime Minister, you should come clean and tell the House in your rebuttal how much you were paying for that. It's time to come clean on it. The Minister of Finance laments the delays in the implementation of the capital budgets. And this is not news to us. I mean, it's interesting to listen to the roll call of projects that are intended this financial year, and very interesting to hear timelines about these projects. And the truth of the matter is that all governments have faced this problem. When I listened to the minister talk about the DVRP as if it was their creation, the DVRP was created by the former government. That's the reality. It was a project that was designed with the former government, but they have to implement it. When I hear of schools being constructed coming out of the DVRP, when I hear the Dennery Hospital being constructed out of the World Bank, out of the DVRP, but the fact is, no, I won't even claim it as my work. I don't want to. But the fact of the matter is that these projects have been on the drawing board for months, for weeks, and for years, yes, for years. Even it might be difficult to concede ownership and authorship. I understand. Now I'm often reminded, you know, Madam Speaker, of a meeting I had with Sir John Compton when we won the election in 1997. He asked for a discussion with me, and he came to the official residence, and he said to me, you know, I see you have an ambitious program for the country in your manifesto. I said, yes, very, very ambitious. And then he replied, he says, I wish you the best. Good luck. Good luck with the civil servants. Good luck with the civil servants with whom you have to work. But the truth of the matter is that while there may be problems on the bureaucratic side in our speed of decision making, there can be no doubt that there are huge problems on the side of donors. And everybody knows the history, I believe, with the European Union. I think the Minister of Agriculture, both in his former and current capacities, he knows of the problem. But you know, there's a concept in contract law called self-induced frustration. I'm going to borrow that concept and say self-induced non-performance, because it is a disease that affects ministers of finance and could affect prime ministers from time to time. When the prime minister decides that he is going to stop a souffle square because he wants cosmetic changes, obviously that has to affect completion, investment. When he decides that he is going to stop the construction of the administrative complex in Vieux, and now the government faces a bill, I am certain of at least between $10 to $15 million in compensation to the contractor. Now, I'm not going to contest that with you just yet. And we know why that excuse was used. So let's not even go there. But the point is, I needed to be taught a lesson. Kenny Anthony needed to be taught a lesson. We're going to stop that project to show Kenny Anthony. What? It's a little difficult for me to cry. It takes a lot for me to cry. It takes a lot. But that was the intention. That was the intention. It did not matter that the people of Vieux do not have not one major government building to house offices of a government institution. It did not matter. And as for me, I had absolutely no objection. This government having won the election, if this government insisted with the contractor that his people were to be employed at the administrative complex. Why? I was only interested in jobs being provided for the people in my constituency. I don't have much time in politics. I don't want no legacy of any building. But the people of Vieux deserve something different. You should never be punishing a politician and in the process deny people what they deserve. But I shall come to that in a few minutes. If growth, as the member for Castries North rightly said, declined from 1.9% in 2015-2016 to 0.9% in 2017-2018, then we have to understand that small as it was, those capital investments were necessary and helpful in sustaining an economy that was struggling to rebound. So we lost an opportunity, and it cannot therefore be surprising that you are dealing with a situation of reduced growth. Madam Speaker, the estimates of revenue and expenditure indicate that an amount of $18,665,975 is allocated to the capital budget of the Ministry of Health and Wellness. The member again for Castries North spoke in great detail about the specific allocations and his plans. He has promised us during the policy debate to unravel the intentions of this government on this matter. What is clear is that by no stretch of imagination does this allocation resolve the financial requirement of the health sector. It cannot. It's impossible. It's impossible. We can finance new buildings. That's the easy part. But unless we can find a way to pay the cost of access to medical care, we will get nowhere. Our challenge is to be able to find a mechanism to deal with the issue of the cost of health care and access to health care. Yes, I do. And never forget that you have that new hospital through me. I'm the one who, yes, that's correct. That is correct, who negotiated it. Yes, you can come. Now, that having been said, Madam Speaker, I see the member for Castries North is reminding you and refreshing your mind. There's a lot you need to know. I won't tell you what's going through my mind. Leave that alone. All I want to say, Madam Speaker, is this, that we have to fashion an approach. We have to develop a new approach to finance access to health care. That brings me back, I remember, in the term of the former government, when we suggested that a bipartisan committee be appointed on the agreement of both government and opposition to arrive at a common position on how we finance health care. Now, that suggestion became a victim of the politics of the times. I believe the member for Castries North, who had been slated to be chairman, was not found to be viable, was not found to be the best person to be chairman at the time. The vagaries of the politics of the day apparently spoke for him and torpedoed that possibility. No. No. I believe that we have a collective responsibility to take healthcare out of this partisan warfare at this time. Look at the situation that you have. You don't have the revenue. You have to borrow heavily to survive. Your deficit is climbing. You claim that the country is overtaxed. You simply do not have the resources on hand to deal with it. Perhaps what we might want to consider at this stage is to set up a bipartisan committee to look at the issue of financing, but with a difference. Instead of elected parliamentarians being on that committee, that we have private sector representatives selected by the respective parties with an independent chairman to look at this issue once and for all and to remove it from the domain of competitive politics. Madam Speaker, this affects every single member of this House, of this chamber.
Honourable Member, I wish to inform you that you have 15 minutes within which to complete your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And perhaps we might want to take a fresh look, because those of us who attend to our constituency office will know that a day does not go by if you're not inundated with requests to finance your constituents or to pay for their medical bills. But I want to turn, Madam Speaker, because in a debate like this, you can only select certain things to speak on. And no, I wouldn't like your generosity. But I want to touch one matter. The Minister of Finance gloats over the fact that a sinking fund of some $12 million will be established. And he says from the funds generated by the increase in airport taxes. I'm subject to correction, but that's what has been repeatedly said. You wish me to sit down? Clarification or point of order?
You can let me stand and I'll make my point.
My pleasure.
Yes, Honourable Member.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask for the suspension of Section 3210 to allow the former Prime Minister an extra 15 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I do not wish the extra time. I thank the leader of government business. We all know that the arrangement was for 1 hour. Now, I know that I'm about to touch a raw nerve. He says that of the revenue generated from this increase in airport taxes, he will set up a sinking fund, and $12 million will go in that sinking fund. Now, in preparation for this, Madam Speaker, a statutory instrument was issued on November 3rd, 2016, laid in this House, and an act called the Airport Development Act was cited as the authority for these new taxes. It says, in exercise of the power conferred under Section 3.2 of the Airport Development Act, Cap 1540, the Minister responsible for finance makes this order. So, and I can forgive the individual who signed this. The then acting Minister of Finance was the member for Miku North, Gail T.C. Rigobert. But there's an interesting dimension to this. This is unlawful. It's illegal. You have cited as the authority to promulgate this an act that has long been repealed. The Airport Development Act is no longer in existence. It was repealed by the Huanora International Airport Development Act number 7 of 2015 in Section 25. The section says the Airport Development Act number 2 of 2011 is repealed. And number 2 of 2011 is cap 1540. Now, mercifully, that you have decided to postpone implementation of this, but any money that is collected for travel after that period, you have to return it, because it is unlawful. And I will tell you this further. You cannot claim to be accessing money from the airport development tax and putting it in a sinking fund unless you amend the Huanora International Airport Development Act to allow you to do this. Doing this is ultra-virus. And of course, if I'm wrong, I'd be more than happy to apologize that I'm wrong. I'd be more than happy to do so. And neither do I intend to cast any legal commentary beyond what I have said, only to emphasize that the remedial action must be taken as of now and very quickly. A topical issue, Madam Speaker, and I want to just say a few words on it as we come to a close. And there's other matters that I must touch. Is the issue of NICE. So much has been said. Madam Speaker, yesterday the member for Grosley and the Minister for Equity, Social Justice, Empowerment and Human Services, my goodness, an extraordinary title by all accounts. Whew. I think we have to try and look for a shorter version to describe him. Sought to explain the allocations to the various programs on his ministry. He attempted as well to explain his famous words that he will always be against NICE, and he says, I make no bones about it. Now, of course, there are other things he added to his statement, and yesterday he attempted to clarify what he meant. It is not he really was in opposition to the purpose of providing employment, but it is an agency that was. He twisted and turned. He changed his clothes, came back again, changed his clothes, came back again to explain and justify himself. But I think we should be clear. NICE was always a temporary program. We have to accept that fact. The former government said it was a temporary program. It was an interim measure to tackle unemployment. The issue was always when would be the best time to begin to scale down NICE. Question was, subsidiary, did the economy recover sufficiently well? Was the economy sufficiently strong that alternative employment opportunities could be found for the persons at NICE? But at the same time, the intention was that the experience would be evaluated and those aspects of the NICE program that worked well, that contributed to the welfare of the country, then by all means we could consider the possibility. And no one, despite all the criticisms to and fro, have objected to the idea that the elderly care program be absorbed. But there's no question that there has been a lot of anguish and a lot of pain. And when citizens lose their jobs or cannot get paid for work that they do, it is natural that they're going to react with disappointment and anger, unless, of course, you are, and these things are never easy to understand. Perhaps if ever you got into the position of a mother with children who's not sure where the next meal is coming from, then it would be difficult to understand that mother's pain. It would not be difficult, sorry, to understand that mother's pain, anguish, and despair. But that's the reality that faces us. Now, the real question is this, and this is what the minister should have touched. Was he justified in dismissing those workers in the elderly care program, recruiting a new batch with 1 or 2 former employees thrown in the mix for decoration to say, look, we are helping out and we've been fair? That's really the question. You know, Madam Speaker, I can say without a fear of contradiction that when NICE was created, then opposition parliamentary representatives, some, maybe not all, were allowed to make recommendations from their constituencies. I know that for a fact. Many of them, now ministers, made use of that opportunity. So this, and I see the member for Miku North is shaking her head because she knows full well what I'm saying is correct. Reluctantly. Now she's not doing it reluctantly. I don't know about the business of cash recycling. That is a different kind, and we shall come to that. But interestingly, we were not afforded a like opportunity. The question is whether this could have been handled differently to help to reduce the pain, the anger, and the discomfort. That's the question. Why are we institutionalizing such discord, enmity, and hatred in our communities? Because this is what has happened. These small communities are at war over these matters, and these are the consequences of that kind of political behavior. Madam Speaker, may I inquire, how much time do I have? 5 more minutes. Madam Speaker, I now turn to a vexed issue on the grants and contributions at page 445, head 21, Office of the Prime Minister. Under this head is recorded that the historical subvention to the St. Lucia National Trust has been eliminated, reduced to 0. No explanation has been offered by the Minister of Finance in his presentation to this House, understandably so, to justify his actions. He avoids it like the plague. However, again on the St. Lucia News online, and should you want it to be a document of the House, easily done, I have a copy. One of his favorite news outlets, as you know, quotes him as follows, quote, "In the case of the National Trust, the intention is that I don't believe that the government should be paying for the recurrent expenditure of the trust. So if the trust has a business plan and wants to make an investment, then they are free to approach the government and make that request, and we will invest it on the basis of the merit of the project," unquote. But the chairperson of the trust, Dr. Pasanta Chase, in a recent interview over a private radio station, tells the country differently. A, the Minister for Finance, the Prime Minister, told her at a private meeting that unless Tulsi is fired, the trust will not be supported financially. Tulsi had lost credibility. Tulsi had written the Queen regarding Prince Harry's participation in the famous DSH sword-turning ceremony. Dr. Chase maintains this never happened. Never happened. And frankly, I believe her because Tulsi is too bright to do such a thing. She also said that the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister was prepared to remove the assets from the trust and place them in another entity. That the decision to grant a loan to the trust for constructing an office by the last NIC board and the former government was revoked. In all my political life, I have never seen such a deliberate, calculated act of abuse of political power and authority meted out to an organization and to individuals as this. This is vindictiveness and crass pettiness beyond irrationality. There is such a thing as equality of treatment. And no public functionary is free of it. The Prime Minister is a public authority and has a duty to be fair in his treatment of individuals and civil society organizations. If the trust is required to submit business plans, then all civil society groups in receipt of public funds must also be required to submit business plans. For some people in the country, the past means nothing. We do not want to learn from it. And I readily admit I may well be guilty of it from time to time. But this trust is not a creation of the St. Lucia Labour Party. It was a creation of the father of the United Workers' Party, Sir John Compton, even when he faced the most intense political battles against his opponents. He understood the mission of the trust. He never attempted to disengage his enemies from involvement in the work of the trust. Ask Sir Julian Hunt. Ask Sir Julian Hunt. In his height of opposition to the United Workers' Party, he never removed him and his role in the trust. I have had disagreements with the trust. I have been opposed to their positions. But I've also had the courage to call them, speak to them, and seek to deal with their issues. In all of this, the words of Vishnu Tulsi will echo forever. Unless you place value on heritage, you will not see the value of what we do. Madam Speaker, for me, this is a defining moment. Yesterday, in an effort to draw the attention of the member of ancillary canneries to the fact that he must not read his contribution to this honorable House, he was quick to say to the merriment and delight, utter delight of some around him, that you are no longer a headmaster. Madam Speaker, this is what Standing Order 3211 says. This is what it says. A member shall not read his speech, but he may read extracts. Monsieur pas ni sentiment aux âges. Vous êtes corrigé. I'll come to you. He may read extracts from written or printed papers or books in support of his argument and may refresh his memory by reference to notes. I am never fazed by insults. It's all part of political life. And this particular one coming from the smallest and shortest man of this House. A temporary comma in the scheme of things is like water off a duck's back. Madam Speaker, I say to him that I'd rather be a headmaster, at least it is close to one of my callings, than a tyrant presiding over a budget that is constructed on quicksand. I will not support this budget. I will never support a budget that is used as an instrument of revenge and vindictiveness. Madam Speaker, I thank you very much.